The emergency beacon shrieked through the crystalline halls of the Veltaran High Council like the dying breath of civilization itself. Ambassador Vekalan had heard thousands of distress calls in his 40-year diplomatic career, but nothing absolutely. Nothing had ever carried this raw edge of absolute terror. His 6 arms, each ending in delicate manipulator appendages that had signed countless peace treaties, now shook uncontrollably as the holographic display materialized above the council table. The image that flickered to life would haunt his dreams for whatever time remained to his species. New. Meridia Colony was burning, not the clean burn of conventional warfare, where structures collapsed and smoke rose in predictable patterns. This was something far worse, a methodical dismantling that looked almost surgical in its precision. Massive mechanical appendages, each larger than a city block, were literally peeling away layers of the planet's surface, like some cosmic surgeon, removing skin from a patient. This is Commander Veltar of the Outer Rim Defense Force. The transmission crackled through layers of interference and what the Kalan recognized as barely controlled panic. Static filled the gaps between words, but the terror was crystal clear. The Shadow Fleet has broken through our outer perimeter. They're not just destroying our worlds, they're harvesting them. Converting everything, every building, every ship, every person in it, to raw materials for more war machines. The transmission paused, and in that silence, the Kalan could hear the screams of billions echoing across space. When Veltar's voice returned, it was hollow, defeated. We have maybe 6 hours before they reach the core systems. Our fleet ... God help us. Our entire fleet couldn't even scratch their paint. The holographic display shifted, and the Kalan felt his 3 hearts skip. Beats in unison. The footage showed massive black vessels, each one easily the size of a small moon, moving through space with the deliberate patience of apex predators. But these weren't just ships. They were floating factories of annihilation. As he watched, in horror, one of the Shadow Fleet vessels extended dozens of mechanical arms toward a dying planet, stripping away its atmosphere, its oceans, its very crust, and feeding everything into processing chambers that glowed with malevolent energy. Within hours, that planet's entire mass had been converted into 3 new Shadow Fleet destroyers. You know that feeling when you're watching a horror movie and you want to scream at the characters to run? Well, imagine that feeling, except the monster is real. It's the size of a moon, and it's currently eating your neighbor's house. That's what every member of the Veltaran High Council was experiencing right now. The Kalan's senior advisor, a brilliant strategist named Kethmer, whose purple scales had earned him the nickname the Violet Sage, turned a sickly pale Gratha. The Lataran equivalent of someone's face going white with shock. His voice cracked like breaking glass as he spoke. Sir, according to our tactical analysis, our entire combined fleet couldn't stop even one of those ships. Our most powerful plasma cannons would be like throwing pebbles at a mountain. What do we do? The Kalan stared at the tactical display, where red dots representing the Shadow Fleet crawled across the star map like a spreading infection. 300 vessels of unimaginable destructive power, and the terrifying truth was that each victory made them stronger. Every world they consumed added to their numbers. Every civilization they harvested became ammunition for their war machine. The mathematics were simple and horrifying. At their current rate of expansion, the Shadow Fleet would consume the entire Veltaran Republic within 72 hours. After that, they'd move on to the next civilization, then the next, until nothing remained but their endless armada of mechanical death. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn, because sometimes, when facing the impossible, the only rational response is to do something completely irrational. There's only one option, the Kalan whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of what he was about to suggest. Send a distress call to the humans. The silence that followed was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop if pins made. Sounds in the vacuum of space, which they don't. But you get the idea. Kethmer's jaw literally dropped open, revealing rows of crystalline teeth that chattered with shock. The humans? His voice climbed several octaves, which in Veltaran biology indicated either extreme surprise or the onset of a nervous breakdown. But sir, They're barely a century into space travel. By galactic standards, they're still playing with chemical rockets and nuclear weapons. They're primitives with crude technology and no real military experience against threats like this. Another council member, Defense Minister Zechtel, leaned forward with his 4 eyes wide. Ambassador, with all respect, the humans have never faced anything more dangerous than themselves. Their biggest military engagement was something they called World War II, which was essentially throwing metal at each other on a single planet. How could they possibly stand against a force that's conquered half the galaxy? The Kalan turned away from the tactical display, and for a moment, his expression carried something that might have been the ghost of a smile. It wasn't a happy smile more. Like the expression of someone who's about to bet everything on a single roll of the dice because it's the only dice left in the box. You're absolutely right, he said quietly. By every logical measure, calling the humans is the act of a desperate fool. Their technology is centuries behind ours. Their military doctrine is designed for planetary conflicts, not interstellar warfare. They've never faced an enemy that could harvest entire worlds. He paused, watching as another colony winked out of existence on their sensors, consumed by the approaching darkness. But here's what you're missing, my friends. Every other advanced civilization in the galaxy has the same reaction. When they see the Shadow Fleet, they calculate the odds, realize they can't win, and either flee or surrender. The Helix Confederation retreated behind their fortress worlds. The Centaurian Empire negotiated a non-aggression pact. The Crystal Dominion simply went into hiding. The council chamber fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of dawning understanding. The humans, the Kalan continued, his voice growing stronger, don't have advanced enough computers to properly calculate impossible odds. And even if they did, they have this disturbing habit of ignoring mathematics when someone needs help. As if summoned by his words, another transmission burst through their communications. Array this one from their embassy on the human homeworld of Earth, the human ambassador. A surprisingly fierce female named Patricia Wong appeared in miniature, hologram form. Ambassador Thekalan, she said, her voice carrying that peculiar human quality of controlled urgency. We've received your distress signal. President Harrison has authorized the immediate deployment of Task Force Vengeance to your coordinates. The Kalan felt hope flicker in his chest like a candle in a hurricane. How many ships can you spare, Ambassador Wong? All of them, she replied simply. Every ship, every weapon, every human willing to fight. We don't do halfway measures when friends call for help. The transmission ended, leaving the Velteron Council staring at empty air. Outside their windows, the first distant flashes of the approaching Shadow Fleet were beginning to appear on the horizon. They had called for backup. The humans were coming. Whether that would be their salvation or simply a more dramatic form of mutual destruction remained to be seen. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Thunderstrike like a man carved from granite and pure determination. His weathered hands gripped the command rail so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and his jaw was clenched with the kind of tension that comes from watching something so horrific it rewrites your understanding of evil itself. For the 10th time in 3 hours, he replayed the Veltaran distress signal on his personal display. Each viewing hit him like a physical blow. The images of planetary destruction weren't just military footage, they were a window into hell itself. Entire worlds stripped bare in hours, their populations converted into raw materials for an enemy that treated genocide like a manufacturing process. Morrison had seen combat before. Desert Storm, the Mars Colonial Uprising, the brutal siege of Europa Station. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for footage of entire civilizations being fed into mechanical digesters like grain into a harvester. His blood didn't just boil, reach temperatures that could power a fusion reactor. Lieutenant Emma Rodriguez called from the communications station, her voice carrying that particular strain that comes from delivering bad news repeatedly. We're getting responses from the alien governments we contacted about joint operations. Morrison didn't turn around, but his reflection in the viewport showed eyes that could have melted steel. Let me hear it, Rodriguez. It's the Centaurian Empire. Says they're evaluating the situation and will respond through proper diplomatic channels. She read from her display, her voice dripping with barely contained disgust. The Helix Confederation offers their thoughts and prayers, along with a formal statement condemning the violence. The Crystal Dominion suggests we convene a galactic peace summit to discuss terms with the Shadow Fleet. You know that feeling? When you ask your neighbors to help you move furniture, and they all suddenly remember they have somewhere else to be? Well, imagine that scenario, except instead of furniture, it's the survival of entire civilizations, and instead of neighbors. It's supposedly advanced alien species who apparently majored in advanced excuse-making at the Galactic University of Cowardice. Let me guess, Morrison cut her off, his voice carrying the kind of dry humor that comes from complete and utter disgust with bureaucratic nonsense. Everyone's too scared to actually help, so they're hiding behind committees and paperwork while billions die. Yes, sir, Rodriguez confirmed, and Morrison could hear the anger in her voice. But Admiral, there's something else. The Volterans are expecting maybe a small task force, a few dozen ships at most. They don't know we're bringing the entire Third Fleet, Morrison finished, finally turning from the viewport to face his crew. His eyes swept across the bridge, taking in faces that reflected his own determination mixed with the kind of controlled fury that made humans particularly dangerous when properly motivated. Through the massive transpersta windows that dominated the Thunderstrike's bridge, the assembled armada stretched out like a constellation of deadly stars. 250 human warships, each one built according to a simple philosophy that had served humanity well throughout its violent history. When diplomacy fails, superior firepower makes an excellent translator. These weren't the sleek, elegant vessels favored by other spacefaring races. Human ships looked like what they were, tools of war designed by a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of controlled violence. The hulls were angular and brutal, packed with weapon systems that prioritized hitting power over aesthetic appeal. They looked like hammers because that's exactly what they were, designed to be. The bridge's tactical display showed the fleet composition in glowing holographic detail. 68 heavy battleships, 92 destroyers, 46 cruisers, 38 assault carriers, and 6 massive dreadnoughts that served as mobile command centers. Each vessel represented the concentrated effort of humanity's best military minds, armed with weapons that could crack moons and shields that could absorb the energy output of small stars. Captain Ryan Blake's voice crackled over the come-from. The U's Wolverine, his Texas drawl carrying across the void between ships. Admiral, with all due respect, the intelligence reports show these Shadow Fleet ships are each 10 times larger than our biggest battleships. Some of them are the size of small moons. The tactical odds against us are the odds, Morrison interrupted, his voice taking on the quality of tempered steel being drawn from a forge, are that some alien friends called for help. And when someone calls for backup, you don't send a diplomatic note or a fact-finding committee. You don't send thoughts and prayers. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled fleet. Each ship representing thousands of human lives ready to die for people they'd never met, simply because it was the right thing to do. You send everything you've got, and you make damn sure the bastards who started this mess understand what happens when they pick a fight with someone who fights back. The communication system chimed with an incoming transmission. The holographic image of Ambassador the Colin materialized above the command table. The Veltaran diplomat's 6 arms were trembling, and his usually composed features were twisted, with a mixture of desperate hope and overwhelming gratitude. Admiral Morrison, the Kalan began, his translator converting alien speech patterns into words that carried the weight of a dying civilization's last hope. Your generosity is ... overwhelming. We had hoped for perhaps a small contingent, maybe 2 or 3 dozen ships, to help with evacuation efforts. But surely such a massive military response isn't necessary. For Morrison stepped forward, and the alien ambassador's words died in his throat. There was something in the human's eyes that transcended species barriers, a kind of focused intensity that spoke to the primal part of every sentient being's brain that recognized an apex predator when it saw one. Ambassador Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions and living with the consequences. When someone threatens our friends, this is what necessary looks like. The silence that followed stretched across space itself, filled with the weight of unspoken promises and the kind of commitment that transforms ordinary people into legends. Behind Morrison, his bridge crew worked with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood they were about to make history. Lieutenant Rodriguez coordinated with fleet communications, ensuring every ship had updated tactical data. Commander Jackson ran final checks on the weapon systems that would soon paint the void with the fury of human determination. Chief Petty Officer Williams monitored the jump drives that would carry them into battle against impossible odds. But here's the thing about humans that no alien species had quite figured out yet. They had this peculiar habit of treating impossible odds as a personal challenge rather than a reason to quit. "Admiral," came another voice from the tactical station, "we're receiving final confirmations from all ship commanders. The fleet is ready to jump on your command." Morrison nodded, his reflection in the viewport showing a man who had accepted the weight of 60,000 human lives and the fate of an alien civilization. Outside, the Thunderstrike's massive engines began to build power. The rumble transmitted through the ship's hull like the heartbeat of some mechanical god of war. "Signal all ships," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying across every bridge. "In the fleet, tell them what my grandfather told me before D-Day. Sometimes you don't fight because you know you can win. You fight because it's the right thing to do. You let the winning take care of itself." The jump drives powered up with a sound like thunder rolling across the cosmos, and 250 human warships prepared to hurl themselves across space toward an enemy that had never known defeat. They were about to learn what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object with a really bad attitude and a lot of nuclear weapons. Captain Lisa Torres had seen plenty of things during her 15-year career that would make most people lose sleep for months. The bloody aftermath of the Titan mining disaster, the twisted wreckage of civilian transports caught in pirate raids, the haunting silence of abandoned colonies where families had simply vanished without a trace. But nothing absolutely. Nothing had prepared her for what greeted the human fleet as they dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Velteron space. The U.S. Reaper's viewports, designed to filter out the harsh radiation of deep space and provide crystal-clear images of distant stars, now showed something that made Torres' stomach clench into a knot of pure ice. Her hands, which had remained steady through countless battles and emergency situations, began to shake as her brain struggled to process what her eyes were telling her, where the industrial world of Kethmer should have been a thriving planet of 12 billion souls, with orbital factories that had supplied half the sector with advanced technology there, was only a skeletal framework of twisted metal floating in space like the bones of some cosmic giant. The planet was gone. Not destroyed in the traditional sense, where chunks of rock and debris would mark the grave of a world. No, this was something far more horrifying. Kethmer had been systematically dismantled, piece by piece, layer by layer, until nothing remained but a geometric lattice of support struts and processing equipment that pulsed with malevolent energy around this mechanical skeleton. Clouds of harvested materials drifted in perfect geometric patterns, entire continents reduced to their component atoms, organized and sorted like inventory in some nightmarish warehouse. The Shadow Fleet had turned an entire planet into raw resources, leaving behind nothing but death and the efficient machinery of industrial-scale genocide. "Mother of God," Weapons Officer Tommy Chen whispered from his station, his voice barely audible above the bridge's environmental systems. Chen was a 20-year veteran who had seen combat in 3 different star systems, but his face had gone pale as parchment. You know that moment in horror movies when the characters finally see the monster, and you realize that all the build-up and suspense was actually the easy part? Well, welcome to that moment, except the monster is real. It's the size of several hundred moons. It's currently digesting the remains of a civilization that was older than human recorded history. Torres forced herself to focus, pushing down the primal terror that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. Her crew was looking to her for leadership, and 12 billion dead Veltarans deserved better than panic from the people who had come to avenge them. "All ships, this is Reaper," she said, opening the fleet-wide communication channel. Her voice carried across the void to 250 human vessels, each one filled with people who were seeing the same impossible horror displayed on their own screens. "What you're looking at is what we're up against. These things don't just conquer territories or defeat armies. They consume entire civilizations and turn them into ammunition for their war machine." She paused, letting that sink in. In the background, she could hear the steady beeping of sensors as they cataloged the impossible scope of the destruction. 12 billion people reduced to raw materials in less than 72 hours. "This isn't a war," Torres continued, her voice growing harder with each word. "This is an extermination. And every ship, every weapon, every piece of technology they build makes them stronger for the next genocide."
Tactical.
The tactical display that dominated the Reaper's bridge. The Shadow Fleet appeared as a wall of crimson death, 300 vessels, of varying sizes, each one pulsing with dark energy that made their most sensitive. Instruments screamed warnings about radiation levels that should have been impossible. The smallest ships were the size of city blocks. The largest dwarfed anything humanity had ever constructed, their bulk blocking out entire star fields. It's like mechanical eclipse events. But here's where things got really interesting, because while the human fleet was staring in horror at the remains of Kethmer, the Shadow Fleet was staring right back at them. "Captain," her tactical officer reported, his training keeping his voice steady despite the circumstances. "The Veltaran Defense Fleet is requesting immediate communication. They want us to retreat immediately." The holographic image of Admiral Kethrin, the Veltaran fleet commander, materialized above the bridge's communication console. His usually proud bearing was broken, his 4 eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from watching your entire civilization disappear. "Captain Torres," he began, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had already accepted defeat. "You must withdraw immediately. The Shadow Fleet is too powerful. Should evacuate the remaining colonies and try to preserve what we can. Engaging them in direct combat is suicide." Torres looked at the tactical display where the math was brutally simple. The Shadow Fleet outmassed the human forces by approximately 10-1. Their energy signatures suggested weapons that could vaporize entire cities with single shots. Their defensive capabilities had proven immune to every weapon the Veltarans had thrown at them by every rational measure. Admiral Kethrin was absolutely right. This was suicide. Torres thought of her kids back on Earth, Maria, age 7, who still believed her mom was invincible, and little Carlos, age 4, who had made her promise to come home and help him build a treehouse. She thought of the promise she'd made to her husband before leaving. The promise to be careful, to not take unnecessary risks, but to remember that she had a family waiting for her. Then she thought of the billions who had died screaming as their world was stripped away, atom by atom, their final moments spent being processed like raw materials in some cosmic factory of death. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. "Admiral Kethron," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from absolute moral certainty. "I understand your position. Your people have fought bravely, and you've done everything you could. But here's the thing about humans: we have this really annoying habit of not knowing when to quit." She turned to face the tactical display where the Shadow Fleet had begun moving toward them like a tide of mechanical death that had never known defeat in its peace. "Millennia of conquest. Signal all ships," Torres commanded, her voice cutting through the fear and uncertainty that filled the bridge. "Tell them what my father taught me when I was 8 years old and getting picked on by bullies. Twice my size. When evil comes knocking at your door, you don't hide under the bed and hope it goes away. You grab the biggest stick you can find, you plant your feet, you break its damn teeth." The communication systems crackled with responses from across the human fleet. Captain Morrison on the Thunderstrike, his voice grim but determined. Commander Jackson on the Wolverine, already running final weapons checks. Captain Park on the Defiant, whose crew had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments because someone had to be first through the door. The Shadow Fleet had begun accelerating toward them, their movement creating ripples in space-time itself. Energy readings spiked across every human sensor array. Weapon systems that could crack moons began powering up with sounds like distant thunder. All ships, Torres continued, her voice now carrying across every human vessel in the fleet. Weapons. Free battle stations. And let's show these mechanical bastards what humans do when someone messes with our friends. 250 human warships turned toward the approaching darkness, their engines building to full power, their weapon systems charging with the accumulated fury of a species that had crawled out of caves and decided to pick fights. With the universe itself, the Shadow Fleet had consumed dozens of civilizations, each one falling quickly once they realized the futility of resistance. They were about to discover what happened when they encountered a species too stupid to understand. The word impossible. The first Shadow Fleet scout ship approached the human picket line with the mechanical confidence of a predator that had never encountered anything but prey. Its artificial intelligence, refined through the conquest of 47 civilizations, calculated the expected response pattern with cold precision. A few desperate shots from primitive kinetic weapons, followed by the inevitable retreat as the inferior species realized the futility of resistance. The Shadow Ship's tactical systems had seen this scenario play out countless times across the galaxy. The Helix Confederation had fired exactly 17 shots before their entire fleet turned and ran. Crystal Dominion had managed 32 before their commanders ordered a full withdrawal. Even the proud Centaurian Empire, with their legendary warrior culture, had lasted only 41 shots before accepting the mathematical certainty of their defeat. The Shadow Ship's sensors locked onto the lead human vessel, a relatively small destroyer called the UES Hornet Tand, prepared to catalog another species' predictable surrender. Its adaptive shields powered up, ready to absorb whatever pitiful energy weapons these primitives might possess. While its consciousness began composing the standard surrender demand in the human's crude language, instead, it encountered something that literally broke its tactical algorithms. The humans charged, not a cautious probe or a defensive maneuver, but a full-speed, screaming assault straight into the teeth of the Shadow Fleet's formation. The UES Hornet came in at maximum burn, its captain apparently having decided that the best defense against impossible odds was to hit them really, really hard. What the hell are they doing? The Shadow Ship's AI might have wondered if it had been programmed for philosophical contemplation instead of efficient genocide. This wasn't in any of its behavioral models. This wasn't how prey was supposed to behave. The Hornet opened fire at point-blank range, its railgun spitting tungsten slugs at a significant percentage of light speed. The Shadow Ship's adaptive shields designed to absorb and redistribute energy weapons suddenly found themselves trying to deal with solid matter traveling fast, enough to punch through small moons. For the first time in its artificial existence, the Shadow Ship experienced something its creators had never programmed it to handle. Surprise. Admiral Morrison watched from the Thunderstrike's bridge as captain. Blake led the first assault wave straight into the heart of the enemy formation. Like a man possessed by the ghost of every human warrior who had ever charged uphill against impossible odds, the tactical display showed the human fleet spreading out in attack formations that would have made Patton weep with pride, not because they were particularly sophisticated, but because they demonstrated the kind of aggressive simplicity that had carried humanity from caves to the stars. "Sir," Lieutenant Rodriguez called from communications, her voice barely audible over the symphony of destruction playing out across their sensors. "Captain Blake reports that the Shadow Ship's adaptive shields are failing against kinetic bombardment. Their defensive systems weren't designed to handle solid projectiles." Morrison allowed himself a grim smile. Humans had been throwing rocks at their enemies since before they discovered fire. It figured that their most advanced descendants would still find ways to make throwing things really, really hard the solution to complex military problems. The Shadow Ship's adaptive shields, marvels of technology that could absorb the energy output of entire stars, sparked and failed against the primitive fury of human railguns and missile barrages. It was like watching someone try to catch bullets with a butterfly net designed for catching photons. You know how sometimes the most advanced solution isn't necessarily the best solution? Like how a $50,000 smart TV can be defeated by a $2 universal remote, or how the most sophisticated computer security system in the world can be bypassed by someone guessing that your password is password 123. Well, welcome to the galactic equivalent of that phenomenon. Sir, his communications officer suddenly shouted over the battle noise, her voice carrying the kind of urgency that makes everyone on the bridge stop what they're doing. Captain Torres is requesting permission to ram the Shadow Fleet command ship. Morrison's head snapped toward the tactical display, where the UES Reaper was shown accelerating toward the largest Shadow Fleet vessel, a moon-sized monstrosity that served as the enemy's mobile command center. The ship's course trajectory showed a perfect intercept, with Torres apparently planning to use her entire vessel as a guided missile. Morrison barked into his communicator, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making impossible decisions. Torres, I need you alive to coordinate the second wave assault. Find another way too. The transmission cut off in a burst of static, and Morrison watched in horror as the EU's Reaper's icon disappeared from the tactical display in a brilliant explosion that registered across every sensor in the fleet. Captain Lisa Torres, who had promised her kids she'd come home to help build a treehouse, had made her own decision about what mattered more than promises. The explosion was visible even without magnification, a miniature star blooming against the darkness of space as the Reaper's fusion reactor overloaded, taking a Shadow Fleet destroyer with it in a fireball that would have been beautiful if it hadn't represented the deaths of 300 human souls. Admiral, his tactical officer, reported, his voice mixing awe and terror in equal measure. The Veltaran observer ships are requesting an explanation. To the completely ineffective. They're asking why their previous engagements failed so badly compared to what we're achieving. Morrison didn't look away from the tactical display where the battle was unfolding like some cosmic version of the Alamo, with human ships throwing themselves against impossible odds with the kind of reckless courage that had defined his species since they first decided to climb down from trees and argue with saber-toothed tigers. Captain David Park's voice crackled over the fleet communication system from the UES Defiant, his southern drawl somehow managing to sound conversational despite the fact that he was currently flying through a debris field of exploding alien warships. Admiral, I'm seeing an opportunity to take out their flagship, but it's going to require getting real close and personal with their main command vessel. Morrison understood immediately. Park wasn't asking for permission to attack the enemy flagship. He was asking for permission to die in the most productive way possible. Do it, Captain, Morrison replied, his voice steady, despite the fact that he was essentially signing the death warrant of another 300 human souls. Make it count. On the tactical display, the UES Defiant changed course toward the Shadow Fleet's massive command vessel, engines overloading as Park pushed his ship beyond every safety limitation built into her design. The ship began to glow with the kind of energy discharge that typically preceded catastrophic reactor failure. Tell them it's simple, Morrison said, finally answering his tactical officer's question about the Veltaran inquiry. His voice carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime studying the art of controlled violence. The Shadow Fleet are hunters. They're used to dealing with prey that runs when the odds get bad. Park's ship, the UES Defiant, disappeared in a miniature supernova that briefly outshone the local star, taking out the Shadow Fleet's flagship and sending shockwaves through their formation that disrupted their coordination algorithms and left their tactical systems struggling to adapt to an enemy that kept doing things that made no mathematical sense. But humans, Morrison continued, his voice filled with the kind of cold fury that comes from watching good people die for the right reasons. Humans fight dirtier when the odds get worse. We don't get discouraged by impossible mathematics. Get pissed off, turn to face his bridge crew, all of whom were staring at him with the kind of expression people get when they realize they're witnessing history being made in real time. And right now, these mechanical bastards just made the worst mistake of their existence. They picked a fight with someone who actually fights back, the Shadow Fleet, which had conquered 47 civilizations through the simple expedient of being bigger, stronger, and more technologically advanced than everyone else. Suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that treated superior firepower as a personal insult rather than a reason to surrender as the battle raged across the void. One thing became crystal clear. The age of easy conquest was about to end in the most explosive way possible. The final Shadow Fleet command ship died exactly as it had lived, without mercy, without honor, and without understanding what it meant to face an enemy that refused to accept defeat. Its massive hull, which had weathered the destruction of 47 civilizations, finally buckled under the concentrated firepower of the remaining human vessels. The dark energy core that had powered its reign of terror imploded into nothingness, creating a brief singularity that swallowed the ship whole before winking out of existence. In that moment of absolute silence, as the last echoes of weapons, fire faded into the cosmic background radiation, something fundamental shifted in the galaxy's balance of power. The mechanical tide that had consumed dozens of worlds, that had turned entire civilizations into raw materials for an endless war machine, was finally and permanently broken. But victory, as any veteran will tell you, always comes with a price. Tag written in blood and sacrifice. Ambassador the Kalan stood in his observation chamber aboard the Veltaran flagship, his 6 arms pressed against the transparistyle viewport as he watched the human fleet attempting to regroup in the aftermath of the most brutal space battle in recorded galactic history. The tactical display showed the mathematics of heroism in cold, unforgiving numbers. Of the 250 human warships that had answered their desperate call for help, only 73 remained intact enough to maintain life support. Another 41 were listed as mission killed, technically still afloat, but so damaged they would never see combat again. The rest had been vaporized, crushed, or converted into expanding clouds of superheated plasma. During the 12-hour battle that had literally rewritten the laws of what was considered possible in military engagement, 60,000 humans had entered this battle. 15,000 would be going home. Yet somehow, impossibly, they had won. The Shadow Fleets, the terror that had devoured entire sectors of the galaxy, without ever suffering so much as a tactical defeat, was now nothing but debris drifting in the cold vacuum of space. Their adaptive technology, their overwhelming numbers, their centuries of tactical experience, all rendered useless by an enemy that simply refused to acknowledge that losing was an option. You know how sometimes you watch a sports game where one team is completely outmatched, outgunned, and outclassed. They somehow pull off a victory through sheer determination and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that makes commentators run out of superlatives. Well, imagine that scenario, except instead of sports. It's the survival of galactic civilization, and instead of a game. It's a battle where the losers get converted into raw materials. Ambassador, his aide whispered, his scales shifting too. The deep gold color that indicated overwhelming gratitude mixed with disbelief. Admiral Morrison is requesting permission to begin search and rescue operations for any Belteron survivors in the wreckage fields. The Kalan felt something break inside his chestnut from sorrow, though the grief for the lost would come later. But from an emotion so powerful, it literally didn't exist in Veltaran psychology until this moment. These humans, having just sacrificed 42,000 of their own people in a battle that wasn't even their fight, were asking permission to risk our lives searching for alien survivors among the debris. The concept was so alien to galactic military doctrine that it required the creation of new words in several languages just to describe it. For context, when the Helix Confederation had retreated from their first encounter with the Shadow Fleet, they had left behind 17 damaged ships, containing over 3,000 wounded personnel, writing them off as acceptable losses. When the Crystal Dominion had withdrawn from their engagement, they had abandoned an entire colony of civilians rather than risk their military assets in a rescue operation. The humans, having just fought a battle that would be studied in military, Academies for the next 1,000 years were asking to risk more ships and more lives to save people they had never met, from a species they had known existed for less than a week. "Tell Admiral Morrison," the Kalan said, his voice thick with an emotion that his translator struggled to convert into human speech patterns, "that the Veltaran Republic formally requests alliance with the Terran Federation. It's not as subject seeking protection from a superior military power, but as brothers who stand together against the darkness." He paused, watching through the viewport as human rescue ships moved through the debris fields with the methodical thoroughness that had characterized their entire military response. These vessels, many of them damaged from the battle, were systematically searching every piece of wreckage large enough to contain survivors, regardless of whether those survivors were human or Veltaran. "Tell him," the Kalan continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a civilization's gratitude. "Tell him that we finally understand what it means to call humans friend." The communication went out across the fleet, and the response was immediate. Admiral Morrison's voice, hoarse from 12 hours of combat command, but still carrying that indefinable quality of leadership that had held his forces together through impossible odds, came back within minutes. "Ambassador Vakalan, it would be our honor to stand with the Veltaran people. But I need you to understand something. This alliance isn't about military protection or mutual defense treaties. It's about family. And family doesn't abandon family, no matter how bad things get." In the cold vacuum of space, surrounded by the wreckage of the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known, something entirely new was being born. Not an empire built on conquest, not a federation held together by mutual fear, but something that transcended the usual political structures that had defined galactic civilization for millennia. It was the recognition that some bonds transcend species, transcend logic, transcend even the basic survival instincts that drive most civilizations to look out for themselves first and worry about everyone else later. The rescue operations continued for 72 hours, with human crews working around the clock to locate and evacuate survivors from both fleets. When it was over, they had saved over 4,000 Veltaran personnel, would have otherwise been written off as casualties of war. But the real impact of the battle was just beginning to be felt across the galaxy. Word spread through hyperspace. Communication networks faster than the speed of light itself. The Shadow Fleet, the unstoppable force that had terrorized entire sectors, had been defeated by a species that most civilizations still considered primitive. More importantly, humanity had suffered massive casualties in a fight that wasn't their own, simply because someone had asked for help. The Helix Confederation, which had offered thoughts and prayers while hiding behind their fortress worlds, suddenly found themselves reevaluating their foreign policy. The Crystal Dominion, which had suggested peace talks with an enemy that considered diplomacy a form of premial entertainment, began quietly inquiring about the possibility of mutual defense pacts. The Centaurian Empire, whose warrior culture had folded after exactly 41 shots against the Shadow Fleet, sent an embassy to Earth with a formal request to study human military doctrine. They had called for backup. Humans had come with a war fleet, and now across the galaxy. Every spacefaring civilization understood a fundamental truth that would reshape interstellar politics for generations to come. Humanity didn't just fight for themselves, they fought for anyone brave enough to stand beside them, and they would sacrifice everything to protect those they called friend. The age of fear was over. The age of humanity, with all its chaotic courage and stubborn refusal to accept the impossible, had begun in years to come. When historians tried to identify the moment when humanity transitioned from a minor spacefaring species to the moral center of galactic civilization, they would point to this battle. Not because of the military victory, though that was significant, but because of what came after. The moment when a species proved that the strongest bonds in the universe aren't forged by mutual benefit or shared resources, but by the simple willingness to stand up for others when the odds look impossible. The end.